day of finance and operators here in the world of cannabis. What a world we live in here. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to the Beard Bros Media. Jeff and Bill are doing some wonderful things with their amazing team in the world of cannabis with their media and LinkedIn Lives with focuses on various aspects of the industry. They're working on bringing in and bringing together subject matter experts and all fields of the industry. And today we're here to focus on the world of finance. And I feel like we need to have a cross section here between not only ancillary and finance folks, but also operators within the industry. I think that's very, very important because we all work together. It definitely does take a village, and we all have to support each other. So with that in mind, what I want to talk about is the financial ecosystem of cannabis is very fragile. So to speak, we're building the airplane while it's flying. I've been hearing a lot of that lately, and I think that's how everybody really feels here. And our goal here, and as ancillary and as operators, is to work together to achieve sustainable growth within this emerging industry, one step at a time. So here today, as I mentioned, we have a great cross section of ancillary and operators, so we can look at this from all angles. And Will Bowden, he's here from Grasshopper Farms. I'm going to let him kick it off with an introduction. He's actually, doesn't look like he's in the airport, but he is. And this is the life in the day of the CEO and COO of Grasshopper Farms. So we'll kick it off with introductions, and Will, you can kick us off.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to the Beard Bros Media Network. Awesome opportunity here. So my name's Will Bowden. I'm the founder and CEO of Grasshopper Farms. I am at the Denver airport right now, as Rachel commented on, because work doesn't stop, right? So for us, we are a somewhat unique farm because we are striving to be in the market to provide premium sun-grown flower. So that's a higher quality outdoor flower. So we started with that in Michigan. We did this, started 3 seasons ago. So this will be our 4th season in Michigan. We then expanded into Colorado, and we're also about to be plant touching in New Jersey with the goal of having 10 different farms across the United States. The other thing about our organization, in addition to us being people first and family oriented, is that we're putting together what we like to call a decentralized MSO. And what that means to us is that the farms, each one of the 10 farms, is going to be responsible for managing their own budget and decisions. And then each of the farms will actually support each other, getting like roles onto calls and collaborating with each other, but really leaving that decision-making process down to that local level.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Some people are commenting they can hear the gates being called in the background, and they love that. This is the life in a day, right? So this is what we do. We wear multiple hats and we show up. And
Rachel, just to that point real quick, you guys, everybody who's listening right now, we discussed this. We said, hey, Will, you're going to be in the airport. Should we do this? And it was a unanimous, immediate yes, because this is what it takes. Like, this is a business in an evolving industry right now that takes you to develop a sound business plan, build an awesome team, and then you got to go execute against it. And the work doesn't stop just because you're stepping into an airport and trying to go from one farm to the next, right?
We're going to get you running through the airport next. So we love that. Okay, let's go to Beau Whitney of Whitney Economics. I see Beau all over the world. I've seen him in Germany. I've seen him in Netherlands. And I think I've seen you in the US too, as well. So we kind of run into each other everywhere. And so he's a man on the go as well, and very well respected in his area.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I think it's important, as much as it is to maintain the businesses, it's important to take time for events like this to understand, to have knowledge share, education, see what's going on with other folks. And so I'm Beau Whitney. I'm the founder and chief economist at Whitney Economics. We do economic research. We're the data guys. But we also provide insights and consulting and policy analysis and the like. We have clients on practically every continent, from governments to regulators to operators. And we're based out of Oregon, one of the kind of the ground zero of cannabis for a long time. But I'm just delighted to be here and happy to share some thoughts today.
Thanks, Beau. And then the other famous Peter Sue, who I also see all over the place. I swear, I see all these people on this panel right here. I see you guys everywhere. And we run into each other. We're all on the go while we're running businesses. And Peter is definitely not an exception to that rule.
Rachel, thanks for having me. Will, I hope somebody stops you and asks you for your autograph over there. Speaking of seeing everyone, Beau and I are advisors to two separate boards together, which is a weird coincidence. And of course, I just interviewed Will and Rachel. You and I do some content together as well. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the Beer Brothers. And so Peter Sue, I am on the banking and financing side of the business. So I have ran two separate prior cannabis banking programs. This is actually my third cannabis banking program. And I was also a consultant to a number of programs all around the country. So banking and financing is I guess, what I'm here for.
That is what you're here for, Peter. So with that, and I'm Rachel Wright of 420 CPA, the managing partner of 420 CPA. We've been in the industry since 2009, very long time. So we're based in California, but we operate internationally and across the country. And I think with kind of having worked with people in California, we've seen the whole market evolve. We've been through every phase of the market. And now in this time in the market, we actually have a unique opportunity. And that's what we're going to touch on today. What are the unique opportunities we have in this market today? And with that, I'd love to give Will some time to really talk before he jet sets here. On our discussion point, our first discussion point, which is cannabis is a localized industry. The economics of geography. What does this mean? Act local but think global.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So first of all, each state is its own market, right? So we have to really figure out how it is that we're going to write and execute against a business plan that's built for that particular state. One of the pitfalls of that is that we might see successes in one state and try to apply business practices that worked in that regulatory or business environment that aren't going to work in the other state. And I think we see this a lot as folks are expanding throughout the United States. They might take something that's a well-intended business practice from another place and try to apply it to a new place, and it just doesn't quite land the way it should there. So I think that's maybe part of it. Another thing I think about too is how do we pick the people that we work with? And this is really, really important. So we at Grasshopper Farms don't believe that we have a competitive landscape. We have a landscape in which we complement each other. So it's a complementary operator landscape for those who know how to run a business. But there's a lot of people I think who got into the industry too, they're very enthusiastic about cannabis, but they're not quite sure how to run a business. So well-intentioned, right? But they're just not quite sure how to. And so in picking the people that you work with, you really got to go through that dating period for a minute there where you're saying, like, how is this person or company to work with administratively? Do they pay their bills on time? Are they going out to consumers with the same sorts of synergies and things that make sense to you as well? Like we at Grasshopper Farms think that education, transparency, and inclusion are our top 3 priorities within the industry right now, in addition to, of course, us putting out quality and consistency of a premium sun-grown product. So I just say a lot there, Rachel. I hope I was addressing the things that you're asking for there.
Absolutely. And I'd say,
I just want to riff off of what Will said. Each state is different. And, it's not just from an operator perspective. A lot of regulators try to copy and paste from various markets as well. And they replicate the same mistakes from a regulatory perspective from one state to the other and to the other. So I think it's really important to understand each market and then develop a hybrid model where you take elements of one state and another state and another state and then customize it for your operation in the state that you're targeting. So I think I can't emphasize that enough, and Will does a great job in articulating that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say also, it's municipalities as far as what I see, not just the states, but which cities are you operating in? What's your competition in those areas? What are the regulators doing in those areas? For example, here in California, and even just in the region of Southern California, you can have one operator doing very, very well. Let's even talk about retailers. They could be doing very well because they don't have too many licenses surrounding them. So they're not at that place where it's a race to the bottom yet. Whereas some municipalities don't realize they're kind of trying to split the baby, so to speak. And so that's obviously, it hurts the industry. So regulators who are short-sighted, I think, can also damage the industry. So can we speak to that a bit?
So I'll just jump in here before I have to go. And the first thing I'll say about regulators is we got to cut them all some slack. Like these are the same regulators. Sorry, these are the same regulators that were actually tasked with writing and executing against regulations that were against this industry at one point in time, right? And so now what they're trying to do is they're trying to put together regulations that first keep their constituents safe from a product that we don't, globally speaking, know enough about yet, right? And then after that, I think business conducive environment actually comes probably secondarily to that. They're just trying their best, right? And so what we got to do is do exactly what Beau just said is we have to pay attention to what are those regulations, state level, local level, and it's not plug and play. You can't just take one state and municipality from one place and apply it to the other. So you've really got to start working with that state and local regulators. But here's the key. Go talk to them, be a part of their process, help them understand how you work in your farm versus how they think you do, because they don't operate a farm, right? So it's really important that whether you contribute to surveys or go to the luncheons or maybe some sort of an association, an industry association, to get your voice out there so that we can all build this together while giving each other grace to say that this is new for a lot of people and it's just not going to be easy, free flowing right out of the gate. It's going to take a little time here.
Definitely. And I think also effective coalitions are very important as well. Will, before you leave, I want you to talk about, expanding the market and the customer base, appreciation of the product, and widening the customer base. How do we do that? How do we do this education?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Perfect. Last thing I can talk about before I hop on. So you guys, I think just what Will thinks right now, I think we're at the very beginning of a market that's very exciting for people and very focused on THC. Okay. And not a lot of people really understand it outside of maybe what they've seen in the media, movies, books, and all of that kind of stuff. Right. So we have to be really, really careful with education right now and make sure that we're helping people to understand what is this product, how does it help people, how do people benefit from it, and there's so many different things out there. So I think then as people stop focusing on THC for like the excitement, okay, and they start focusing on the real things like the therapeutic effects that come from the cannabinoid and terpene profiles, that's when the customer base, if we will, or consumer base is going to start to get, I think, more developed, and people will start making more decisions that are based off of the effects that they're seeking versus the excitement of trying a high THC something. One of the folks on our team, Cole Cratton, he likes to talk about how terpenes are the music and THC is the volume. And when people really start to understand that concept and they start to pursue products for their ingredients versus a singular high number, I think that that's going to open up everything for a lot of consumers. The other thing too is that there's this notion out there that recreational use is going to outpace all the other uses out there. I don't think so at all. I think recreational use is a very small fraction of the market, and the medicinal use of this product is actually the thing that's holding more consumers' attention than anything else. We're just not educated and accustomed to saying how we are using it though for medicinal use. Like anybody who says that they're relaxing at the end of the day or they're getting better quantity and quality sleep are both, those are medicinal uses, but we don't all jump into calling that some sort of diagnosis of medicinal use. So I think that's really going to be a part of the education.
Thank you so much. Well, we should let you go, and safe travels.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate you guys.
Appreciate you being here.
Just to emphasize that point, I spoke at a conference in Berlin, Germany in 2017, and I was, on the main stage on day 2, and I was presenting data on why people consume cannabis. And day one, the keynote speaker was Dr. Raphael Mechoulam from Israel. And he was talking about all of his medical study and his peer-reviewed studies that he had going on, his clinical studies. And what was really amazing was that the reason that people were using and had identified cannabis as a product to consume, it mirrored exactly some of the research on the effects on the human body that Mechoulam was presenting the day before. And so there is this, anti-anxiety, sleep, appetite stimulant, appetite suppressant, and other things. And so it seemed as though at that time, even in 2017, that the consumer was ahead of the science in this regard. And so I think it's important for all of us as a community to continue that education and continue the foundation that Mechoulam built and laid the foundation for, and to continue to advance this from a public awareness perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, what are very practical and tactical ways of doing that? So when we say that, what does that look like?
Well, a lot of times, it takes individual conversation. It's very time consuming. But if there are opportunities to reach a larger audience, just like this, this webinar today, I mean, this is great. But it takes really reaching out to a larger body to educate them and demystifying cannabis as a product. I found that I did some volunteer work for at-risk youth, and I was the kind of the cannabis guy, whereas you had all of these other folks that looked at, heroin and meth and other things, and they were, why do young people begin to use this product? And when I started bringing in some of the benefits of the use, not by youth per se, but identifying some of the benefits of cannabis use, it really opened the eyes up to the people that were advocating, and identifying issues with heroin and meth and other things. And so even in that forum, when there was experts on substance abuse, they didn't realize, the full spectrum of benefits that the cannabis plant represented. So even in that section, in the environment, there was education that took place, and it demystified it. And it wasn't a gateway drug, for example, and like some people in the meetings actually thought, And so it takes that. It takes also being out there and being a public figure, and helping educate and putting yourself out there and saying, here is some data, here is the narrative. Do they match? Yes, no. If they don't, then here's why. And there's a lot of benefit that can be done from that educational, those efforts.
Well, I love that, because it's education that's actually going to expand the market, and so that people aren't kind of fighting over, a small piece of the pie. Let's talk a bit about. I know the hot topic obviously is rescheduling, and we can get out
Hey, Rachel, can I just add one more comment?
Please.
In the discussions of cannabis, it's very emotional for people. It's an emotional issue. And so people either have a very positive emotional reaction to cannabis, or they have a negative reaction to it. And so it's important to go into those conversations and take the emotion out of it and provide data. And so, that's this type of work that I do. Peter does it as well. It's just different audiences. And so it's bringing the data so that people don't get so emotionally attached to it, and that they can actually talk in terms of like, here's what the data says, regardless of what the emotion is in the conversation.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. Peter, I want to give you a chance to chat about anything that we've been talking about, kind of widening the customer base, developing appreciation for the product, education, and how does that help to impact the bottom line of all these businesses?
Well, continuing the thread of sort of policy and regulatory regime and stuff like that, it was actually something that Beau said once about if you were to look at the regulatory regime of each state when they were setting up their cannabis program, excuse me, when we talk about banking, the question you have to ask yourself is, was this meant to be business friendly? Like, did they set up the regs so that if you were to open a cannabis business, these regs have been designed, crafted for you to be successful? Or were the regs designed to be to appease prohibitionists, right? And if you think about the fact that in many states, like much more thought has been given to like limitations, right? You can only buy X per day. Packaging has to look like this. I think you can clearly see that, unfortunately, most regs were not designed to be business friendly, to be industry friendly. And I think that that's a common theme here that we're talking about is, well, how do we change that, right? Because it's clear that we started started at a bad place, and we wanted to move away from the stigma. So to Will's point, look, people did the best they could. The regulators operated in a situation where they had to appease two different masters, if you will, and one master did not have much of a voice at the table.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to riff on that a little bit, cannabis operators have to be malleable. They have to be flexible and adapt to the changing environment. It's very dynamic right now. And it's dynamic from state to state to state, depending upon the evolution of that market, the maturity of the market. But what I've found is, and I agree with Will that you need to cut the regulators some slack because they're learning how to regulate at the same time as the operators are learning how to be regulated. But at the same time, I don't recommend giving them a total free pass. And in that regard, what I found is that the regulators have been really hyper-focused on just a couple of things: public safety, which is a good thing to focus on, and youth access, which is another good thing. We don't want to necessarily promote the use of cannabis by people under 21, right? But at the same time, they've been very inflexible and not adapting to the changes in the environment. And as a result, because it's been so constrained from a regulatory perspective, operators around the country are not making any money. And so they're not healthy. And when they're not healthy from an economic perspective, then they make poor choices. And if they make poor choices, it can actually run contrary to the public safety objectives that the regulators have in mind. And so I think the advice to the regulators out there is that they need to be just as malleable and just as adaptive to the environment as the operators that they're regulating.
I mean, from my perspective, we're on the front lines every day with operators that are suffering from overtaxation, clearly. And, I think if regulators want to see this as a way to make revenue and generate revenue for their municipalities or for their state, we need to do it in a sustainable way. So, for example, one of the conversations I was having the other day was with a DASNY, somebody who actually is part of the DASNY program in New York. And unfortunately, what's going on with that program, and I talked to a couple other professionals, is that they built out their store with the DASNY loan, and it was overinflated what that loan was. To build out the store, it was maybe like $300,000, but the loan was $1.8 million. And now within 3 months, they're on the hook to repay this loan. And so the folks that I work with, we're trying to figure out, is there a way that we can get a delay on the start of this loan so that this person doesn't have to hand their keys back? So I think the regulators need to keep in mind that we want to set people up for success. We don't want to set them up for failure. And that is definitely one of the programs that I think there's a wide consensus that people are set up for failure. And the whole point of the program is for people to be able to get a leg up, right? These are a lot of social equity applicant winners. And social equity applicant license winners, so to speak. And it's like, how are they being set up to fail from the beginning? There's lack of foresight. And so I'm going to be a little bit tougher on the regulators because I have to fight these battles on a day-to-day basis. And especially with the tax front. And speaking from California perspective, the excise tax is killing people, these state and local tax on tax. And this is what I deal with on a daily basis. So I wish, if I had a wish list, it would be that they would keep in mind that these businesses are the golden gooses that actually pay for a lot of the budget. So during COVID, for example, I talked to some, taxing agency, the CDTFA in California, and the rep there said, hey, this is the only thing during COVID keeping our state alive with generating tax revenue was the cannabis industry. Cannabis industry and pizza for some reason. I don't, anyways. So, but why would we kill an industry that can generate so much revenue? We've seen, I love to hear this from you, Beau, because how much revenue is the industry generating for some of these states where they're actually able to fill up their coffers? So why wouldn't we do this in a sustainable way and keep these businesses viable and able to survive instead of killing them,
Yeah, the amount of revenue, people think it's a budget solver, but in reality, the amount of revenue that's derived from cannabis taxes is basically 1% to 2% of the total budgets of these states. So it's not a whole lot relative to other things, but it's significant nonetheless. And if there's good intention and it's targeted in an appropriate way, then that 1% to 2% can do a lot of good. And it can support a lot of additional economic development. It's not going to be as easy to tax it like tobacco and alcohol because there's a substitute product called the illicit market. And when you have a substitute, then there's a pricing sensitivity by the consumers. So in that regard, if you tax it too heavily right now, then it could push people away from the market. And so the key here is to balance access and the pricing differential with not doing too much or trying to rely too much on the taxes and pushing people away. And that's a tough model to develop. We've built that model already, and so we can make recommendations to states. But once they get to the point where they're so reliant on the taxes, then it's problematic for both the operators and the state, because they'll just, their default is, well, let's just raise taxes, and it just doesn't work like that, not yet.
So Peter, I mean, you're on the front lines in the banking industry and cannabis on a day-to-day basis, and as well as lending. Can you speak to the points we were just chatting about?
Yeah, again, tracing back to this theme about the regs being a major factor here. So let's think about the fact your typical cannabis business, what is its most valuable asset? Arguably the license, but you can't put a lien on that license. So in other words, if I'm a bank and let's assume the bank is willing to make a loan to a cannabis business, let's assume that the numbers line up, there's free cash flow, et cetera, which is a big assumption. But let's just say, you have a qualified applicant, you're willing to make a loan, but a typical financial institution wants collateral. They want to know what would happen if the loan defaults. So license can't be liened, inventory can't be liened. Well, what else is in a cannabis business, really? So in other words, I do think we're still talking about the same thing. It's still the fact that at the root of the problem is you created a system that isn't really business friendly. You didn't, it was never meant to be, I don't think.
Yeah. On that note, do you want to chat about safe banking and some of the obstacles that you see in banking today, but also some of the progress that we've made over the last few years? Because I've certainly seen a lot of progress.
Oh yeah, it's evolved so much. So I've been in the cannabis banking aspect of this for maybe call it 6-7 years or so. And it's night and day. I mean, when I first started, which I wouldn't necessarily call the early days of cannabis, right? Like, you hear those horror stories from the early days of cannabis when it was, $10,000 a month just to have a checking account, and it did nothing. Like, it just, here's a checking account, right? Today, I actually think that the reverse is happening in almost every situation I get into where I'm engaged with a prospect, meaning I want to offer banking services to someone. I'm almost always in a competitive situation. They're talking to someone else, and they tend to come back to me with like, well, so and so is charging me less, or are you willing to do more, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I think today the reality is that a cannabis business that wants banking can find it. Now, does the banking that they find, does it match their expectations and their desires? In other words, capability, capacity, and cost. That maybe not. Meaning, is it expensive? Does it maybe not do the things that they want to do? For example, lending is probably the next battleground, or the current battleground, frankly. Are you a financial institution that's willing and able to treat a cannabis business like it's a normal business? So take the word cannabis out of the equation. What would you normally do? Now, again, I do want to highlight the thing that I just said before, which is, well, the reality is, even if you took the word cannabis out of the equation, many of these businesses are very tough to finance from a traditional banking perspective.
Just kind of adding on to that, and there was a question in the comments about what happens if there's a default. It's really, really difficult to recover once you get behind on your payments. And right now there's a payment issue. In fact, vendors are not paying other vendors. And we just published a report on delinquent payments, and nationally there's $3.8 billion in payments that are past due. And that represents almost a couple of months of the total annual revenue of the entire market. So it's a big deal. But if you get behind on your payments, then you can't raise your prices necessarily because there's so much competition. And if you do raise your prices, then a lot of that margin goes to the federal government through 280E taxation. And so if you get farther behind and then you default, then you don't have bankruptcy protection because it's federally illegal. And so it is really, and that results into just personal wealth destruction. And so you see where this is going, right? You have this real tough business environment, low margins. It's tough to get financing. It's available, but if you don't get it and you get behind, then it's basically, and this is a cool economic term, death spiral. It's the only cool term in economics, and so I have to throw it out there from time to time. But anyway, all joking aside, once you foreclose, or once there's really no legal recourse, it's just personal wealth destruction. And so developing a model, a market that's healthy and sustainable, I think that's really the key, so that you don't have this wealth destruction. And banks play a major role in that. And so the thing that I find interesting about what Peter does is that they have to understand the risks in the environment, and then to identify the risks, and then do an appropriate level of risk management from an interest rate perspective and a finance perspective and a due diligence perspective, in order to make sure that they're covered from their shareholders and that the businesses themselves are protected. And so, Peter, can you go into a little bit of that, how you identify the risk and how you incorporate that into your overall processes?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a good question. But actually, before I go there, Beau, there was something I wanted to kind of riff on what you just said, which is, and there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg kind of thing going on, right? Because credit is largely not available, right? That creates, whereas in traditional setting, let's say fashion or whatever, there might be revolvers, inventory lines, more pervasive factoring involved, et cetera, et cetera. And even if it's available, it might be very expensive. And that's partially because of its rarity, right? In other words, this lack of competition. So where I'm going with this is, well, because banks aren't willing to finance the inventory, the industry is self-financing, right? So the terms are being pushed to the manufacturers, and they have very little recourse to collect, right? So again, there's this I guess to your point about this death spiral of the snake eating its own tail. That to some extent is the issue. But again, tracing that all the way back to the regulatory problem is, well, the banks won't do it because there's also no recourse for that, right? So yeah, I mean, it's a very strange question. Like, which do you sell first, right?
And I found that the rise in interest rates that the Federal Reserve had actually did the cannabis industry a disservice, because you get 5% increase in your interest rates. You can get a T-bill, you can get a government bond that's no risk and get 5% return on your investment. Whereas if you invest in a cannabis operator, will you get that return back? It's high risk, low return instead of high risk, high return.
Yeah.
And usually it's the high risk, high return that investors are drawn to.
Yeah.
And so until we get to a point where interest rates are actually lowered, it's going to be a challenging finance environment for the cannabis industry. It's still out there, but you're going to pay a premium.
No, I want to just touch on like operations here too, and outstanding receivables. So what I find is, in this new day and age in the industry, whereas maybe 2021, 2022 and earlier, it was kind of a boon for the industry in certain states, right? So what we're focused on now is operations. So outstanding receivables, it's really a matter of making sure you're in touch with your sales force, your sales reps. This is where operations are super important. And when I go into companies, I'll look at their receivables and talk to their collections department and say, hey, well, why are we still selling to these people? It's very, very simple things. Sometimes it comes down to the very basics. Sales rep know that this customer is 90 days, a year behind. Why are we still shipping product to them? Why aren't we doing COD and things like that? So I think, in light of all of the things that we're talking about, there's some very basic, fundamental, practical tips that we can provide to people, such as, COD for wholesalers. If you're having a real problem, make sure there's a communication loop with your sales reps. Make sure when your sales reps are going out to the retail stores, they preface that, hey, that they're educated and they know how rough the market is. When they're talking to the retail stores and they say, hey, we need to get paid now COD because you've been behind, and start working with, these retailers, because like you said, it's an industry that's funding itself. And we've had a number of bad actors. Now, what I've seen is a lot of these bad actors have been shaken out, or they're on their way to being shaken out. But there's always going to be some. But if we come back to like just very practical day-to-day ways to apply and just very simple techniques, we can also help our own businesses. And it's these businesses that actually focus on their operations that are going to be the survivors, right? Paying attention to those details. Does anybody want to chat about that?
This is where the role of the regulatory groups can come in and actually benefit the operators, because in some states, regulators can mandate payment terms, or they can say, if you're 5 days past due on 30-day terms, then we're going to shut you off completely from doing any business with any of the vendors in the cannabis industry. And so that's, a heavy hand, but sometimes that's appropriate when it comes to these payment issues, because that could wipe out a small business very quickly. And so there's a balance there where the regulatory groups could play a role in improving the health of the industry, and it wouldn't take much, and a lot of them are already empowered to do so. I just did an analysis of the state of Washington, and they actually have those provisions already built into their rules. So it's doable. It just takes some focus and some education of the regulators as well.
Yeah, Rachel, when I think about operations, of course, I'm thinking from a banking financing perspective, and luckily, this actually ties both Beau's question and your question together. Um, when we think about sort of risk underwriting, analysis, et cetera, that frankly, that's a major issue in the industry, right? Um, there's no credit reporting. There's no sort of pervasive data. This actually ties into insurance, right? Insurance business, believe it or not, it is heavily data based. And when I say heavily data based, we're talking decades of data, right? And so again, cannabis doesn't have that now. Beau and I happen to work with a company, we're advisors to a company called C-Trust, where we are trying to put the work into creating sort of these credit reporting, who are the good actors, bad actors. But again, a lot of that comes down to data. And Rachel, to your point about operations, at the end of the day, that's what kind of ties all of this together, right? Who are the good operators?
Also, when I've helped provide economic data into insurance companies, and from either a crop insurance perspective for cultivators or business insurance, and one of the things that has been difficult for the insurers to get their arms around is how much risk is actually out there. Because if somebody has a loss, they may not report that loss because they don't want to raise a red flag, or they don't want to get too much regulatory focus on them. And so they don't want to declare the loss. And even if they do, they can't write that off on their federal taxes. And so there's no incentive for them to identify these losses. And as a result, it makes it really challenging for the insurance companies to understand what the total loss potential is in order to develop effective rates for insurance. So, part of this is the lack of data, and it's also because of the lack of federal data, which could also be fixed. But that's another topic for a different day. But the lack of federal data, but even the operators are not providing that data, so it's really tough to improve some of those basic systems that ordinary businesses use every day.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to touch on, there was an assembly bill in California, Assembly Bill 766, which was going to regulate, those outstanding receivables. And unfortunately, at that time, it hasn't passed. I don't think there's been any movement in over a year on this, but the retailers were kind of freaking out at that time, because they said, okay, well, if we have to pay people within 7 to 10 days, that's unsustainable for our retail business. And so, there's these aggressive moves, and I do believe, maybe potentially, regulators can get involved, but I'd love it if the industry would actually just really start implementing good business practices, because then we don't need regulators to step in, ideally. And so that's the way I'd like to encourage things to happen, is first at the ground level and within our businesses. And then I think regulators ideally would be the last. I'd love us to self-govern ourselves. I know that's a very lofty goal, but so we have about 17 minutes left, and I really do want to talk about rescheduling and the impact of that. And I have a couple other topics to touch on as well. But first, let's talk about rescheduling. And Beau, what's your opinion on that?
Well, so I've provided Congress with a lot of data on the impact of 280E, and overall, last year there was about $2.1 billion of additional taxes associated with 280E industry wide, and a majority of that was borne by the retailers. And so, that's kind of the impact. And this year it's projected to grow to 2.3 billion in excess taxes. So what I mean by that is they're being charged, the cannabis industry is being charged a premium as a result of them being a cannabis business. And if they were treated like a normal business, then they wouldn't have to pay as much taxes. That delta right there is $2.3 billion this year. Now, the pushback in Congress is, well, why would we give a tax break to a bunch of stoners? And I've actually heard that from congressional delegates. But there's actually a net benefit to the economy if you provide this tax reform. And the relief comes in the fact that you don't have as much of a debt burden because you free up your cash flow. You're healthier as a business. You're actually able to expand the market, hire more people, pay more, business taxes because you're expanding your business, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of benefit. So now the devil is in the details in terms of rescheduling. And I'm kind of waiting to see what those details are. And so I'm not, in the people that we advise, I'm saying build flexible policies. And I think Will would have agreed with this. Build flexible policies where you can adapt to a changing environment, but don't necessarily implement those policies until you understand what the changes actually are. Because in some states, they may require all cannabis to be dispensed through pharmacies as a result of it being Schedule 3. So then what do you do if you're a retailer? Does that mean that you just kind of go away? So there's a lot of risks associated with that. But there is, from a tax perspective, there is a net benefit to the industry because it frees up the cash flow. You're not being subject to, sometimes an effective tax rate of 70%. So benefits, yes. Devil in the details, unintended consequences. There's no doubt that there's going to be.
Go ahead, Peter.
I agree with Beau. The reality is we don't know. We have no idea what rescheduling is going to look like. From a banking financing perspective, rescheduling is sort of fascinating in a way because it's a sea change on the one hand, but on the other hand, actually not much changes. So, for example, Schedule 3 obviously is medical, which means that any retailer, to Beau's point, that is adult use, well, you're the same exact shade of gray that you are currently, right? So again, from a banking perspective, right? Any medical operators, well, now you need to somehow fit into this, FDA Schedule 3 framework, which doesn't currently exist, right? So we don't know, can you fit into that framework? And you're talking about FDA process, which is a multi-year, multi-million-dollar process distributed through licensed pharmacies only. So none of which apply to the cannabis industry as it currently exists, right? That said, again, 280E, right? The impact of that cannot be understated. If we think about this idea of in 2022, Amazon's effective tax rate was somewhere in the 5% range, and your average cannabis business's effective tax rate was somewhere in the 70% range. As a bank, if I look at the free cash flow, again, keep in mind on a forward basis, right? So it's gonna take a year, maybe 2 years before you start feeling banks saying, okay, you're making 2 times, 3 times the amount of money that you were previously. That is huge. But from a regulatory perspective, it sort of feels like not much changes. Now, there's a major caveat here, which is, well, logically, so in 2014, when FinCEN reacted to the Cole memo by releasing FinCEN 2014, So would the major legislative change like rescheduling, will they logically follow suit? Logically, yes. So in other words, new guidance comes out, renders what I just said completely moot.
Yeah. So, I guess 280E perspective, I see, obviously we're a tax firm, so we've seen all these tax returns come in from new clients and things like that. And we've looked at their past tax returns and, I think 280E is definitely an issue, but I also think a lot of there's a lot of things that can be done in light of 280E that are legal. And at the end of the day, if you're working with the right person that actually understands 280E, understands what you can do legally, and has been through years of audits, and knows at the end of the day that this is negotiation. So if the IRS does audit you, it depends on who comes in as an auditor, depends on who their supervisor is, depends on what the amount that's on the table. If they want to fight it, half the times they kick it back from tax court down to appeals. So it's not just black and white issue. I know that what people say is it's like 60 to 70%. To be honest, I don't see that. I know that that's kind of the number that goes around, but that's not our experience and having been in the industry since 2009. So I'm just saying, I see a lot of tax returns come across my desk from folks that really shouldn't owe any money. And this is not just a plug for me. This is just this is really that we have a lot of people that actually don't understand what can be done. So that's my spiel on that.
The one thing that we did a survey during a webinar with a CPA firm and a bunch of financial folks, and what would you do with the additional resources that would be gleaned from 280E reform? And overwhelmingly, they said, we want to catch up on our back payments, and we want to make sure that we catch up on our debt and our debt payments. And almost zero said that they were going to pass it on to their consumers through price decreases and the like. Some said that they would go into increased marketing budgets, but the majority was, hey, we're just going to shore up our operation right now and get healthy so that we can live to fight another day.
So let's talk about, rescheduling in light of, when I talk to some operators, they say, oh, well, now we're going to start shipping across state lines, and they think the floodgates have opened for interstate commerce. And, I know the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce did an awesome rescheduling webinar yesterday as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. But, from your perspective, what kind of floodgates are open from an international and from a interstate commerce kind of situation here, if any? Or how long do we have to wait until we find out what the impacts are going to be before we start shipping cannabis from California out to New York and flooding the market out there in other states, or, from Canada out to Europe via the US? So
I hear a rumor that might be happening now. That's
it's already happening. I mean, but I guess legally.
I went to a social club in Spain, in Barcelona, and the bottom shelf was kind of run of the mill Spanish grown. The medium shelf, higher quality Spanish grown. Top shelf, California. And so, yeah, there's a fair amount of exports that are going on right now. But once again, the devil is in the details. So we don't know what a lot of this means. It's highly unlikely that it's going to open the floodgates to interstate commerce. But that's still to be resolved. Definitely not international. And so, that's going to take additional reform. But bringing it back to the act local and think global, and the influence of local regulators and different codes and all this stuff. There was a proposal for a cultivator tax in California that would be 2 cents a gram when I calculated it all out. Didn't seem like very much. But in some places around the world, the wholesale price for cannabis is a penny a gram. And so by taxing things at 2 cents per gram at a local level, it doesn't seem like very much, but it could make a system whereby U.S. cannabis is globally not competitive from a pricing perspective. And based upon some of the inputs from the Schumer, Booker, and Wyden bill, also known as the CAOA, they were proposing to allow immediate importation of cannabis into the United States. And so if you can import at a penny a gram, then that 2 penny tax in Northern California is going to make them uncompetitive, from purely a pricing perspective. So a lot of these policies have to consider local, state, federal, and international implications. And it's very, very important to be cognizant of these things when you're developing your business, operating your business, and refining your business.
So I'm just going to answer a question in the chat. What's the effective tax rate? It really depends. Depends on if you're a producer, and depends if you're non-producer. That's like number one. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. It just, everything completely depends. It depends on how much of a risk you want to take as a business owner, staying within the bounds of the law, clearly. But it's a classic answer of it depends. You know, so I'm just going to answer that question. I also want to answer the DASNY question from way back. The DASNY question is, you know, I was chatting with an attorney and also a operations person, a consultant who's helping this retailer. They may have to hand their keys back. Okay. So that is what's going on. That's what I'm working with the attorney to see if we can work with DASNY to extend the terms of the loan a little bit longer, a loan they should not be in actually. And so that their initial payment will be months down the road instead of imminently when they haven't exactly gotten the foot traffic that they're supposed to get. Because otherwise, if they don't get an extension of the loan and this crazy rent that they have, they will actually have to hand the keys back, and that's it. It's a setup to fail from the beginning. So that's another word of advice is when you're looking to get into these social equity programs, make sure that you have the right people surrounding you that really look at the fine line and the details of these contracts, because you don't want to put all this energy in and the years it takes to get, you know, a store up and going and just to shut the doors. Okay. You need to know what you need to make on a monthly basis in order to make that rent and interest payment, because otherwise you're setting yourself up. So those are the answers to a couple of questions within the chat. But I'd like to kind of like just round this off. We've got 4 more minutes to go. Just in summary, like, where do you see the industry right now, and what's, you know, what kind of pro tips, practical tips can we give to operators and or ancillary providers that can help us all to help the industry fight on another day?
Well, why don't I go first, because I suspect Beau's going to have a very fulsome answer to this. I think that this whole banking and financing that is not available in cannabis, personally, I believe that's a little bit of a myth. If you're talking about banking, so depository services, as I said, the reality is it is available. If there's anybody out there right now that is saying they can't find it, likely what they mean is they can't find one that they like. Now on the financing front, again, I also think there's a little bit of a myth involved here, because I hear a lot of this like, well, we're a cannabis business, so we can't borrow money. Well, that may not be capturing the full truth, right? Let's say, for example, you're in a state like New York, and you're a startup, right? Which most everyone is, right? Well, the reality is most startups can't get financing, so that is not a cannabis question. Then the second tier would be, and a little bit of what you said, Rachel, which is sort of operational, right? Like, do you have all your ducks in a row? Frankly, I often get financing packages where the company is not making any money. So in other words, they can't get financing because they're not making any money, not because they're a cannabis business. And so whether that's today or even post reschedule, I guess, to the question at hand is, look, get your operations right, get your business right. Financing is available, and financing will be much more available post reschedule. Fundamentally, that concept is the same today, and it'll be exactly the same tomorrow.
You're up, Beau.
Yeah, so I'm seeing an evolution of the market right now. A lot of the Canadian big guys, they made these mistakes by expanding too fast, setting up this huge amount of capacity, thinking that there was going to be reform in the United States, and they'd fled the market with supply. And it just became such a heavy debt burden on the Canadians and the Canadian licensed producers that it basically crashed them down. The same thing is going on with the multi-state operators, or MSOs. They set up these vertically integrated systems in each state, growing, processing, retail, and then it just created such a heavy tax burden debt burden on them that they couldn't sustain it. So what I'm seeing in terms of an evolution is that there's a there's a new low touch model that's occurring where big brands are establishing their brands, they're establishing their recipes for products, and then they're outsourcing that to smaller groups within each individual state. And as long as they have high quality and maintain certain standards, and I think this is kind of the Will model as well, to a certain extent. But if you maintain those standards, then you can deploy a brand and in this low touch model, and it can be low cost and high profit. And so I'm seeing that. And so, but I've said for many years now, 10 years, that the success or failure in the cannabis space is going to depend upon three things. One is branding, and branding is an evolving area right now. It's not yet near its maturity. It's still in its nascent stages. Another key to success is scale. Who can grow and scale? And this low touch model is something that can allow businesses to scale and allow for increased participation even by small actors, as long as that they're good and have good quality control. And then the third defining factor is supply chain management. Who can control their costs and run a lean, mean fighting machine in such a way that it becomes a competitive advantage. And so it's really, really important that as business operators, you develop a good set of indicators that can be used to quickly track key parts of your business. And by monitoring and developing that data, and I can help with that, there's lots of people out there that can do this, but by understanding your core business and understanding what levers there are to impact scale, impact branding, impact supply chain costs, then you'll know your bottom line. And then you'll know when you have to make tough decisions on what do I need to change, where are my risks at, and what do we need to do differently in order to maintain our place in this very, very dynamic environment.
Love that. Thank you so much. And I guess my 2 cents is operations, number one, foresight, make sure your 3 to 5 year plan, including if that's an exit plan, is in place. You're monitoring that on a regular basis. Also, we've got legacy operators, we've got kind of the new folks. We can each learn from each other. There's enough history in cannabis where there's enough history in cannabis. There's enough markets that have been around for long enough that have gone through almost, I don't want to say a full business cycle, because we haven't gone to consolidation, or we're not exactly CPG quite yet, but almost there. We have a lot of data out there already, and folks that have been in the industry for a long time have been able to see all the cycles, all the things that have gone wrong. And so just the new folks can learn from the old folks, and the old folks need to kind of come up a little bit and come into the modern day and age. The folks that have been around for a long time, I don't mean old, but the people that have been around for a while, it's not 2010, it's not 2015, it's not 2018. We got to come up with the times, and there's a lot of big players and efficiencies in the market. In order to beat them, we've got to come up and bring our game up. So thank you all so much. And where do we find you, online or elsewhere, Peter?
Oh, I guess I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, Peter Sue at LinkedIn. I don't know how to.
Awesome.
And for me, whitneyeconomics.com. And so try to support as many inquiries as I can.
Definitely. And for us, it's 420cpa.com. And our telephone number is there. And thank you so much to the Beard Bros. Really appreciate everything you're doing here. And your team's amazing. And stay connected with the Beard Bros and their newsletter, the LinkedIn, the live sessions, and everything. More events to come in person, and we'll be all over the place. Stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.